Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The shop held its breath first, as if sensing something approaching on the fog-wrapped wind. Iris felt it in the pause between one tick and the next, a gentle disturbance in the rhythm she had known for 47 years. Her weathered hands stilled over the delicate music box she was mending, the tiny screwdriver poised above a reluctant spring. In the amber glow of her workbench lamp, surrounded by the familiar symphony of timepieces, she listened with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime learning the language of measured moments. Then it happened. Every clock in her workshop, grandfather and mantle, pocket watch and hourglass, the stubborn cuckoo that always ran 2 minutes slow, skipped forward exactly 1 second in perfect, impossible unison. Not a breakdown, but a collective breath, as if time itself had paused to consider something important. The silence that followed felt vast and expectant, pregnant with possibility. Iris set down her tools with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to trust unusual moments rather than dismiss them. The floorboards sang their familiar song beneath her feet as she made her way through the maze of timepieces toward the heavy oak door. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like curious spirits, and somewhere in its depths she heard the softest sound, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably the cry of something small and new. The brass handle was cold against her palm. When she opened the door, the fog seemed to part like a curtain drawn back to reveal a secret. There on her doorstep sat a woven basket, lined with a blanket stitched with stars the color of moonlight. Inside, wrapped in that celestial softness, was a baby whose eyes held the deep gray of storm clouds over calm seas. Not crying now, but watching her with an ancient patience that made her think of old wells and deeper mysteries, Iris knelt beside the basket, her joints protesting the movement, and reached out one finger to touch the impossibly soft cheek. The skin was warm, real, undeniably alive. Tucked beneath the starry blanket, she found a note written in elegant but hurried script. "This child needs someone who understands that time is not a river, but an ocean. Please." She lifted the basket with hands that had steadied countless delicate mechanisms, carrying this new mystery into her workshop, where time lived in all its measured forms. As she settled the baby near her workbench, something extraordinary happened. The infant's tiny face crinkled, releasing the smallest whimper, and every timepiece in the room seemed to slow, their rhythms becoming deeper, more restful, like the difference between a hurried conversation and a lullaby. Then, as if responding to some inner comfort, the baby's expression softened into the faintest smile, and the clocks quickened their pace with gentle enthusiasm, a joyful flutter of hurried seconds that spoke of boundless possibility. It was subtle enough that another person might have missed it entirely, but Iris had spent her life listening to the heartbeats of mechanisms. She knew when something fundamental had shifted. "Well then," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the tick of her favorite pocket watch. "I suppose you'll need a name." She studied the small face, noting how the baby's breathing seemed to synchronize with the pendulum of her grandmother's clock. The child's presence had somehow tuned the entire space to a more harmonious rhythm, like a master musician adjusting an orchestra. "Tempo," she said softly, testing the word like a key in an unfamiliar lock. "Yes, I think that suits you perfectly." As if in response, the baby's eyes fluttered closed. And the most remarkable thing happened. Every timepiece in the workshop settled into a deeper, more peaceful cadence, their collective voice becoming a gentle lullaby that seemed to embrace them both. Iris prepared a makeshift bed from soft cloth and placed it where she could keep watch while working. But as the night deepened, she found herself simply sitting, listening to this new rhythm that tempo had brought to her world. The baby slept with the profound stillness of someone who had never learned to worry about tomorrow. And gradually, Iris felt her own breathing slow to match. She had lived alone for so many years that she had forgotten how to be surprised by the arrival of another person. Yet here she was, looking down at this impossibly small being and feeling something in her chest that had been wound too tightly finally begin to relax. There was no question in her mind about taking them in. Some things arrive on time, even when no one has arranged to meet them. Outside, the fog continued its ancient dance with the harbor, carrying whispered stories of distant places and impossible journeys. But inside the clockmaker's shop, Time had found a new way of moving, not forward or backward, but deeper, like roots growing into rich earth, or like love settling into the spaces between heartbeats. As dawn approached, painting the fog with the softest suggestion of pearl and rose, Iris dozed in her chair with one hand resting gently on the edge of Tempo's basket. She dreamed of clocks that chimed with the sound of ocean waves and music boxes that played melodies she had never heard, but somehow knew by heart. When she woke, she found that every timepiece in her shop was keeping perfect time, synchronized not to any external standard but to something far more profound, the quiet rhythm of a child who had been born understanding that time was not meant to be conquered but befriended. The morning light revealed a world that looked exactly the same as it had the day before, except for one small perfect difference. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbour Street, where Iris had spent decades listening to the language of measured moments, there was now a new voice in the conversation, soft, wordless, but somehow fluent in the dialect of wonder that time speaks when it knows it is truly heard. The morning after Tempo's arrival brought a different quality of light to the workshop, as if the very air had learned to move more gently. Iris woke to find every timepiece in perfect synchronization, not the rigid precision of factory settings, but something warmer, more organic, like a choir that had found its natural harmony overnight. She lifted Tempo from the makeshift cradle, marveling at how the baby's presence seemed to tune the entire space to a more peaceful frequency. In those first tender weeks, Iris discovered that caring for Tempo was unlike anything she had experienced. When the baby grew fussy during feeding times, the grandfather clock in the corner would slow its ancient march, each tick stretching long enough to breathe inside. The effect rippled through the workshop like gentle waves, every mechanism easing into a more patient cadence, as if the entire room was learning to move at the speed of comfort rather than obligation. "There now," Iris would murmur, adjusting Tempo against her shoulder, feeling the small body relax as time itself seemed to exhale around them. The world can wait a moment while you figure things out. And somehow, impossibly, it did wait. Customers who might have drummed their fingers impatiently instead found themselves gazing peacefully through the front window, their urgency dissolving into something softer and more sustainable. Iris began keeping what she privately called her listening book, a small leather journal where she recorded the subtle patterns she observed. When Tempo giggled, a sound like small bells catching sunlight, the mantel clock would skip ahead with gentle enthusiasm, as if sharing in the joy. When the baby sighed in sleep, even the second hands would pause for one extra heartbeat, as if they too understood the value of rest. She learned to read these moments like weather patterns, understanding that Tempo's relationship with time wasn't chaotic, but deeply intuitive. During the long afternoons when Iris worked on repairs, Tempo would watch from a cushioned nest near the workbench, with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in the mystery of gears and springs. When a particularly stubborn mechanism refused to cooperate, when Iris's patience began to fray, she would feel the air around them shift. The clocks would slow just enough to remind her that precision couldn't be rushed, that the most delicate work required the luxury of unhurried moments. "You're teaching me to listen differently," she realized one day, speaking aloud to Tempo as she carefully adjusted a hairspring that had been troubling her for weeks. The baby gurgled in response, tiny hands reaching toward dancing dust motes in the afternoon sunlight. And suddenly the spring settled into perfect alignment. As Tempo learned to sit, then crawl, their exploration of the workshop revealed new dimensions of their gift. They were drawn to timepieces that ran fast, small hands patting against their cases, with the gentle insistence of someone trying to soothe an agitated friend. Under that touch, racing mechanisms would gradually slow to a more sustainable pace. Conversely, clocks that had grown sluggish with age would quicken slightly when Tempo settled nearby for naps, as if drawing energy from the child's natural vitality. It was during this time that Iris first noticed what she came to call rickles and small, localized disturbances in time's flow that seemed to gather in corners like dust, created by the hurried passage of anxious visitors or the sharp edges of worried thoughts. Tempo could sense these temporal snags with the same certainty that others might notice a crooked picture frame. Their small hand would reach out, smoothing the air with the same careful motion Iris used on wrinkled linen, and the rickle would soften, settle, and disappear, Time isn't meant to be mastered, Iris explained one evening as she taught Tempo to breathe with the pendulum's patient arc. It's meant to be befriended, like any relationship worth having. When you feel that little hitch in the world around you, breathe with it, not against it. Left, we listen. Right, we answer. In on the left swing, out on the right. Gradually, Tempo learned that their gift wasn't about control, but about harmony, helping time find its natural rhythm when it became tangled or stuck. The townspeople began to notice changes, though they couldn't articulate what had shifted. Mrs. Chen, who brought her late husband's pocket watch for cleaning every few months, mentioned that her visits to the shop left her feeling settled in a way I can't explain. Young Tommy from the harbour, who usually fidgeted through any interaction longer than 30 seconds, would stand perfectly still while Iris examined timepieces, his attention held by some quality in the silence that surrounded. Then, by the time Tempo spoke their first word, tick, pronounced with the profound satisfaction of someone naming something they had always known, the workshop had become something unprecedented in Iris's long experience. It was a place where time moved at exactly the right speed for whatever needed to happen. Repairs that should have taken hours completed themselves with surprising ease. Customers arrived stressed and hurried but left refreshed, carrying with them some indefinable sense of having been given exactly the time they needed. As seasons turned and Tempo grew from toddler to young child, their understanding deepened like roots finding rich soil. They could sit perfectly still for remarkable lengths of time, not with vacant boredom, but with active fascination, watching dust motes dance in sunbeams or listening to the layered conversations of different clocks. Their presence had become a gift to everyone who encountered it, the gift of unhurried moments in a world that had forgotten how to pause. The workshop breathed with a different rhythm now, one that welcomed both precision and patience, where broken things came not just to be repaired, but to be understood. And in the gentle space between tick and tock, Iris continued her quiet teachings, preparing Tempo for a world that would need their particular kind of healing, their ability to help time remember its most generous nature. On foggy mornings when they walked together along the harbour road, Iris would point out the boats nodding in their moorings like old friends, the gulls whose wing beats matched the rhythm of the long case clock back home. People will rush, she would say, tucking Tempo's star-stitched blanket higher against the coastal breeze. They will think speed is safety. We will show them a gentler way. And in the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, a boy could sometimes be seen sorting through discarded things by the pier, handling bent nails and rusted screws with unusual reverence, as if he understood that broken didn't always mean worthless. Tempo would watch him with quiet curiosity, sensing perhaps that their paths would one day cross, that the boy who collected broken things might have his own gifts to offer, his own way of seeing beauty in what others had abandoned. The harbour bell counted the hours with soft conviction, and somewhere in its measured voice was the promise that time, when befriended rather than conquered, would always provide exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed most. The boy by the pier had been watching them too, though neither Tempo nor Iris realized it at first. His name was Sage, and he lived in the rhythm of tides and discarded things, collecting what others had abandoned with the same careful attention Iris gave to her timepieces. Each morning, he walked the waterfront with a canvas bag slung across his shoulder, searching not for treasure, but for objects that still whispered of their former purpose: broken compass needles, pocket watches with silent hearts, keys that had forgotten which doors they were meant to open. On the morning they finally met, the fog was lifting in thin veils, and Sage knelt at the pier's edge, sorting through his latest finds. Tempo approached with the unhurried curiosity that had become their natural way of moving through the world, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the way Sage handled each broken piece with such gentle reverence, or the way he seemed to listen to objects the same way Iris listened to clocks, with patience and genuine care. "Hello," Tempo said softly, settling beside him on the weathered planks. Sage looked up with eyes the color of sea glass, startled but not afraid. His hands, Tempo noticed, were marked with the small, honest injuries of someone who touched the world directly. Tiny cuts from handling sharp edges, calluses from patient work. "I'm Sage," he said after a thoughtful pause, as if testing whether the name still fit. "I collect things that need..." He gestured vaguely at his scattered treasures, searching for the right words. Understanding, Tempo finished gently, recognizing something familiar in the boy's careful attention to broken objects. I'm Tempo, Sage nodded, then reached into his collection and lifted a brass compass, its case tarnished but still beautiful. This one's been with me longest, he said, cradling it in his palm. It should point north, but it just spins. I keep thinking if I'm patient enough, if I try the right thing. As if responding to his words, the compass needle began its familiar frantic dance, whirling without purpose or direction. But then something extraordinary happened. As Tempo leaned closer, drawn by the small distress they could feel radiating from the instrument, the needle's wild spinning began to slow, not into stillness but into something gentler, a searching arc that spoke of hope rather than panic. Sage's breath caught. How did you— I didn't do anything, Tempo replied with characteristic honesty. Sometimes things aren't broken in the way we think. Sometimes they're just displaced. They reached out one small finger, not quite touching the compass but holding their hand near enough to feel its confusion. It's looking for home, but it doesn't remember what home feels like. Under Tempo's gentle presence, the needle continued its slow searching movement, no longer desperate but patient, as if it had finally found someone who understood that being lost wasn't the same as being broken. Sage watched, transfixed, as his constant companion found a kind of peace it hadn't known since he'd discovered it, wedged between pier pilings months ago. Maybe, Tempo said thoughtfully, it doesn't need to point north anymore. Maybe it wants to point to something else, something that matters more than direction. From that afternoon forward, Sage became a regular visitor to the workshop, arriving with his canvas bag full of discarded treasures and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, always cut diagonally, as if triangles made food taste more like care. Together, he and Tempo developed a different approach to repair, one that honored the history held within damaged things rather than simply erasing their wounds. They discovered that Sage had an intuitive understanding of how things wanted to be whole again. A music box missing half its melody didn't need new notes. It needed silence in the right places, pauses that let the remaining music breathe. A clock with a cracked face didn't require replacement glass. It needed someone to see beauty in the way light caught the fractured surface, creating tiny rainbows with each tick. The compass remained Sage's constant companion, but it no longer spun with desperate confusion. Instead, it moved in thoughtful arcs, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward whatever brought meaning to the moment, sometimes toward Tempo, sometimes toward a successful repair, sometimes toward the simple pleasure of afternoon light streaming through dusty windows. In their growing friendship, something beautiful was taking shape, a partnership built on the understanding that healing wasn't about forcing things back to their original state, but about helping them find new ways to be whole. The workshop filled with their quiet laughter and shared discoveries, while outside, the harbor bells counted the hours with gentle precision, marking time for two children who were learning that the most important repairs happen not with tools, but with patience, acceptance, and the simple gift of being truly seen. As evening settled over the water, painting the sky in soft pastels, Tempo and Sage would walk together along the pier, their friendship deepening like roots finding rich soil, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring to their gentle sanctuary of healing. The morning after their compass discovery brought a gentle rain that made the harbor bells sound softer, more contemplative. Iris suggested they visit the library, while the weather kept most of the town indoors. Thad Sage's compass, now resting peacefully in his pocket, seemed to approve, its needle pointing steadily toward the hill, where the old stone building waited behind a grove of patient cypresses. The library had been many things over the decades: a school where children learned their letters, a hospital where the wounded healed, and finally a repository for all the stories the town had collected. It carried the memory of each incarnation in its bones, the scent of chalk dust mingling with antiseptic, now overlaid with the warm smell of aged paper and the faint sweetness of forgotten tea. Helena moved through the stacks with the quiet grace of someone who had spent 23 years learning the language of books and the people who needed them. Her silver hair caught the light filtering through tall windows, and her eyes held the particular wisdom of someone who understood that the right story could arrive at exactly the right moment if you knew how to listen for what wasn't being said. She noticed Tempo immediately, not just as another child wandering the aisles, but as a presence that somehow tuned the entire space to a more harmonious frequency. When Tempo settled at one of the oak reading tables, the usual restless energy of the library would ease into something deeper. Patrons who normally rushed through their research found themselves absorbed for hours, their breathing unconsciously matching some gentler rhythm that seemed to emanate from wherever the child sat quietly turning pages. "There's something about that one," Elena mentioned to Iris during one of their chance encounters in the poetry section. "People seem to find exactly what they need when they're here." What Elena couldn't see, but Tempo felt with increasing clarity, were the pockets of lost time that gathered in the library's quieter corners. These weren't empty spaces, but accumulated moments, seconds and minutes that people had dropped in their hurry towards somewhere else. A mother who had meant to read one more chapter to her child before rushing to work, leaving that intention hovering near the picture books. A student who had stared blankly at a research text, their mind elsewhere, the moment of potential insight still waiting to be claimed. Tempo learned to sense these temporal deposits the way others might notice dust motes dancing in afternoon light. They appeared as gentle shimmer in the air, heavy with unfulfilled possibility. The child discovered that sitting quietly nearby, breathing with the library's patient rhythm, encouraged these scattered moments to settle and flow back into the wider stream of time. The effect was subtle but profound. A retired fisherman who visited regularly to read tide charts would suddenly remember a poem his late wife had loved, finding himself drawn to the literature section with tears of recognition in his eyes. A harried artist blocked for months would stumble upon an obscure technique manual that rekindled her creative spark. A lonely teenager would discover exactly the story of friendship their heart had been seeking, though they hadn't known they were searching. Elena, though unaware of the specific mechanism, recognized the pattern and began involving Tempo in small tasks. "Would you help Mrs. Chen find something about lighthouse construction?" she would ask, somehow knowing that Tempo's presence would guide the search toward exactly the right resource. The child moved through the stacks with an intuition that went beyond catalog systems, leading people not just to information, but to the stories their souls needed. "Books are vessels for time," Elena explained one quiet afternoon, her voice carrying the rustle of ancient pages. "They hold moments, feelings, entire lifetimes between their covers. When someone truly reads, not just scanning for facts but allowing the story to unfold at its own pace, they're participating in a kind of temporal magic." Tempo understood. They watched how a well-chosen story could mend a fractured moment, offering someone the gift of unhurried reflection when the world felt too fast. The library became another teacher, showing them that healing sometimes meant simply providing space for people to remember how to move at the speed of understanding rather than urgency. Sage joined them many afternoons, spreading his collection of broken treasures across the reading tables. Surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, his repair work took on new dimensions. A music box missing its melody would find new songs in the rhythm of turning pages. A pocket watch that had resisted conventional fixes would suddenly reveal its secret, when bathed in the library's atmosphere of patient discovery. As evening approached and the last patrons gathered their belongings, Tempo would sometimes remain, sitting quietly among the stacks, while Elena prepared for closing. In these peaceful moments, they would gently redistribute the day's accumulated lost time, encouraging scattered minutes to find their way back to people who needed extra moments of peace or reflection. The library hummed with this quiet magic, becoming a sanctuary where time moved at the speed of wisdom rather than worry. And in the reading room where light slanted golden through tall windows, the very air seemed to whisper that life's most important discoveries couldn't be rushed, only received with the patience of someone who understood that the best gifts always arrived in their own perfect time. When they finally walked home through the gentle rain, Sage's compass rested peacefully in his pocket, and Tempo carried with them the growing understanding that their gift extended beyond clocks and timepieces to the deeper rhythms of human hearts seeking their own natural pace in an often hurried world. The morning after their library visit brought news that traveled through the town like ripples on still water. Eleanor arrived at the workshop with her usual grace, but her eyes carried the weight of something difficult. Marcus didn't come back. "With the others," she said quietly, settling into the chair Iris kept for visitors who needed more than timepiece repairs. "They found his boat, but Constance." The sentence hung unfinished, complete in its incompleteness. Tempo had seen Marcus many times along the harbor, a weathered man whose hands spoke the language of nets and tides. He and Constance had fished together for decades, their partnership so seamless that townspeople often spoke of them as a single entity, Marcus and Constance, like salt and sea. She had been the one who read weather patterns in the flight of gulls, while he knew every current and hidden rock along their stretch of coast. Together, they had been part of the harbor's rhythm, departing before dawn and returning with the evening tide. The storm had taken her during what should have been a routine morning, a rogue wave that arrived without warning or mercy. Marcus had pulled her from the water, had tried everything his 47 years of sea knowledge could offer, but some things exist beyond the reach of human skill or desperate love. When the Coast Guard found them, Marcus was still holding her, still calling her name to waves that had already moved on to other business. What happened next was something Tempo had never encountered before. Within days of the tragedy, time around, Marcus began to behave strangely, not the gentle rickles they had learned to smooth, but something deeper and more profound. He would sit on the pier where they had always prepared their nets, and the light around him would hold steady in that particular grey of early dawn, the moment just before the sun commits to rising. Not the hopeful dawn of new beginnings, but the hesitant light of the last morning when everything had still been possible. Tempo felt the disturbance from blocks away, a temporal wound so deep it made the air itself seem to ache with unresolved sorrow. They found Marcus exactly where Elena had said he would be, sitting motionless, while the world moved around him at its normal pace. But in the small space he occupied, time had forgotten how to flow forward. His coffee remained at the perfect drinking temperature, the newspaper beside him never quite finished being read, his gaze fixed on a horizon that seemed perpetually on the verge of revealing something that would never come. "He's stuck," Tempo explained to Sage as they approached carefully, drawn by the pull of something that needed healing, but unsure how to offer it. Not just sad, trapped in the moment before his world changed. Time can't flow properly around that kind of pain. Sage's compass responded to the temporal distortion with gentle acknowledgement, its needle not spinning wildly, but moving in slow, respectful arcs, as if it understood that some displacements were too sacred to approach carelessly. Together, they settled at a respectful distance, not trying to intrude on Marcus's frozen dawn, but simply offering their presence as witnesses to his grief. Iris had taught Tempo that some temporal disturbances couldn't be smoothed away like ordinary rickles. "Grief has its own relationship with time," she had said during one of their evening conversations. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is sit with someone in their difficult moment, not trying to move them through it, but helping them feel less alone inside it." So Tempo didn't attempt to unstick Marcus from his perpetual dawn. Instead, they simply breathed with the rhythm they had learned from years of listening to clocks, allowing their own steady presence to exist alongside his pain without trying to change it. They understood with the intuition that had guided them since childhood that healing this kind of wound required not action, but companionship, not solutions, but the simple gift of unhurried presence. Days passed in this way. Tempo would arrive each morning, settling quietly within the strange temporal bubble that surrounded Marcus, while Sage brought sandwiches cut into careful triangles and the patient understanding that some healing required witnesses. They didn't speak much at first, but gradually, Marcus began to share fragments of memory, the way Constance had laughed at her own jokes, her habit of humming while mending nets, the particular silence she maintained during difficult weather that somehow made the work feel sacred. As Marcus talked and Tempo listened, something subtle began to shift. The frozen dawn around them didn't disappear, but it softened, gaining texture and depth. The light learned to breathe again, not moving forward yet, but no longer rigid with denial. His coffee began to cool at a normal rate, The newspaper beside him occasionally rustled in the actual breeze rather than remaining suspended in temporal amber. The healing happened slowly, measured not in hours, but in the gradual return of small movements. A deeper breath, a shift in posture, the ability to look away from the horizon and back again without losing himself entirely. Tempo learned that their gift extended far beyond mechanical timepieces to the deeper rhythms of human hearts, learning to beat again after profound loss. When Marcus finally stood from the pier bench after 2 weeks of patient sitting, the dawn light around him had learned to advance toward morning. Not quickly, not eagerly, but with the gentle certainty of someone who had been reminded that love doesn't end with loss, it transforms, carrying forward in new ways through the patient flow of remembered moments and continuing days. The harbor bells counted the hours with their usual precision, but now they seemed to acknowledge that some moments deserve to last longer than others, that the time it takes to say goodbye properly cannot be measured by any ordinary clock. The healing of Marcus's frozen dawn had changed something fundamental in the workshop's rhythm, like a deep bell that continues to resonate long after it has been struck. Tempo returned each evening with a quieter step, their understanding deepened by the experience of sitting with profound grief until it was ready to flow again. Iris noticed this shift in the way Tempo moved among the timepieces, no longer as a curious child, learning to repair mechanical things, but as someone beginning to understand the deeper currents that moved beneath the surface of measured moments. It was during one of these peaceful evenings, as autumn painted the harbor in shades of amber and rust, that Iris set down her tools with hands that trembled just slightly more than they had the week before. The tremor was gentle, like the flutter of moth wings, but unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime working with precision instruments. She regarded her weathered fingers with neither frustration nor fear, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who understood that all things, even the steadiest hands, eventually learn new rhythms. The time has come for deeper lessons, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades, held in careful trust. There are things about time that cannot be learned from springs and gears alone, my dear one. They must be felt in the bones, understood in the heart. From a small drawer that Tempo had never seen opened, Iris withdrew an object wrapped in midnight blue velvet. As the cloth fell away, it revealed a pocket watch unlike any in the workshop. Its face was perfectly smooth, unmarked by numbers or hands, yet it seemed to pulse with gentle life against Iris's palm. "This belonged to my teacher," she explained, placing the mysterious timepiece in Tempo's hands. "It doesn't show time, it carries it. Some days it hums with contentment. Others it rests in perfect silence. It will teach you to feel what cannot be measured." The watch felt warm against Tempo's skin, vibrating with a subtle rhythm that seemed to match their own heartbeat. As they held it, the entire workshop seemed to breathe more deeply, every timepiece settling into a more harmonious cadence, as if recognizing the presence of something ancient and revered. "We are not alone in this calling," Iris continued, settling into her favorite chair as the evening light grew golden through the windows. "There have always been those who feel time differently, who understand that it sometimes needs tending, like a garden needs careful hands. We don't control time. That would be like trying to own the ocean. Instead, we befriend it, help it find its natural flow when it becomes tangled or stuck." She spoke of her own awakening to this gift, how as a young woman she had thought herself strange for the way clocks would slow during her deepest concentration, or quicken when joy filled her heart. It was an elderly clockmaker in a distant city who had recognized her abilities and taught her that such gifts came with quiet responsibilities. "He called us time tenders," Iris said, her eyes soft with memory. "Not because we tend time like sheep in a pasture, but because we offer it the same gentle care a gardener gives to delicate seedlings. We listen, we witness, we help heal the places where time has been wounded by haste or sorrow or fear." To demonstrate these deeper principles, Iris brought out a mantel clock that had arrived that morning from a house where arguments had been echoing for weeks. The moment Tempo touched its wooden case, they felt the agitation thrumming through the grain, not mechanical distress, but absorbed discord that had infected the timepiece's natural rhythm. "The clock isn't broken," Iris explained, watching as Tempo's sensitive fingers traced the carved edges. "It has absorbed the household's pain and forgotten its own peaceful nature. Can you feel how it wants to race? to escape the disharmony it has witnessed. Under Iris's patient guidance, Tempo learned to breathe with the clock's frantic energy, not fighting against its distress, but offering it the memory of calmer rhythms. They held the handless watch in one palm, while resting the other on the agitated timepiece, allowing their own steady heartbeat to remind both instruments of time's gentler possibilities. Gradually, the mantel clock's desperate hurrying eased into something more sustainable, its tick becoming less a cry for escape and more a sigh of relief. "This is the deeper work," Iris said as they watched the clock settle into peaceful accuracy. "Anyone can adjust a gear or replace a spring. But helping time remember its own healing nature, that requires understanding that we are partners in something much larger than mechanical repair." As the weeks passed and winter's first frost began to silver the harbor grass, these lessons continued with growing depth and complexity. Tempo learned to recognize the signs of temporal distress that went beyond individual grief or mechanical malfunction, the way entire neighborhoods could develop hurried, anxious rhythms that made kindness difficult, or how places could grow sluggish with accumulated disappointment, making it hard for new possibilities to take root. Sage often joined these evening sessions, his compass now serving as more than a directional instrument. It had become attuned to whatever needed attention most, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward the places where healing was most needed. Together, the three of them formed a small circle of understanding, bound not by formal ceremony but by the shared recognition that time, like any living thing, sometimes required careful tending. One evening, as the workshop settled into its nighttime symphony of gentle ticking, Iris opened her hand to reveal a tiny gear so perfectly formed it seemed more like a jewel than a mechanical component. "This represents the smallest part of time's great mechanism," she said, placing it carefully in Tempo's palm. "It reminds us that even the grandest clock can be stopped by the absence of the tiniest piece, and that the most profound healing often begins with the most delicate adjustments." The gear felt alive against Tempo's skin, warm with the accumulated wisdom of generations who had understood their calling. As they closed their fingers around it, the workshop around them seemed to exhale with deep satisfaction, every timepiece contributing its voice to a harmony that spoke of continuity, of knowledge passed faithfully from teacher to student, of traditions that would endure long after individual lives had run their measured course. Outside, the harbor bells counted the hours with their usual precision, but their voices seemed softer now, more patient, as if they too understood that the most important work happened not in the rushing of daily obligations, but in the quiet spaces where healing grew like seeds waiting for their perfect season to bloom. There you are. Fog rolled in from the distant ocean, carrying whispers of other places where time tenders worked in gentle solitude, each contributing their small part to the vast, ongoing conversation between human hearts and the eternal rhythm that connects all things. And in the clockmaker's shop on Harbour Street, where wisdom was being passed like a carefully tended flame, the future settled into place with the quiet certainty of something that had always been meant to be. The tiny gear remained warm in Tempo's pocket as winter settled over the harbour town, its gentle pulse a constant reminder of the delicate mechanisms that kept time flowing smoothly through human hearts. The lessons Iris had shared in those amber-lit evenings had taken root like seeds in fertile soil, and now walking through the cobbled streets with Sage beside them, Tempo felt the subtle pull of another temporal disturbance calling for attention. Sage's compass began its gentle dance first, the needle leaning with quiet insistence toward the hill, where artist studios nestled between shops, selling hand-knitted scarves and honey from coastal hives. The morning fog was lifting in thin veils, revealing a world painted in winter's softer palette. And it was in this crystalline light that they felt it, a peculiar looping in time's flow, like a song caught on a single, beautiful but endlessly repeating note. They found the studio above the bakery, where morning loaves perfumed the stairwell with patient sweetness. Through the tall windows, they could see a young woman standing before an easel, her dark hair streaked with paint, her shoulders carrying the particular weight of someone who had been struggling with invisible chains. Maya painted with fierce concentration, her brush moving in practiced strokes across a canvas that showed the harbor at sunset, all fiery oranges melting into soft purples. Clouds arranged in perfect formation, boats etched against the horizon in precise silhouettes. But surrounding her easel, leaning against every available wall space, were dozens of other canvases depicting the exact same scene. Not variations on a theme, but identical moments captured with mechanical precision, as if time itself had folded in on itself, trapping her in an endless, beautiful, yet ultimately stagnant loop. Tempo felt the temporal disturbance like a gentle ache in their chest, not the sharp wound of Marcus's frozen grief, but something more like a knot that had been pulled too tight, cutting off the natural flow of creative possibility. The air around Maya shimmered with trapped energy, and each brush stroke seemed to echo with the desperate hope that this time, somehow the painting would open a door to whatever came next. Mrs. Chen, making her usual morning walk past the studios, noticed them standing quietly outside. 3 weeks now, she said with gentle concern. Ever since that exhibition was cancelled, ever since someone wrote cruel words about her work being derivative. She used to paint such wild, beautiful storms. Now she can't seem to move past this single sunset, instead of approaching directly. Tempo settled on a small bench across from the studio window, close enough to feel the edges of Maya's temporal loop, but not so near as to intrude on her private struggle. They drew the handless watch from their pocket, letting its gentle pulse remind them of time's more patient rhythms, while Sage arranged his collection of broken treasures between them, not to repair them in this moment, but simply to honor their existence as things that had once been whole and might someday find new ways to be beautiful. The effect was subtle at first, like the way morning light gradually changes the color of shadows. Maya's brushstrokes, which had been mechanically precise, began to show tiny variations. A cloud edge slightly softer here, a reflection marginally different there. The changes were almost imperceptible, but they represented cracks in the temporal loop, small openings where possibility could begin to seep through like water, finding its way around stones. Sometimes, Tempo said softly, speaking not directly to Maya, but to the morning air that carried their words through the open studio window. The most beautiful things come from dancing with what we can't control rather than trying to perfect what we can. Their voice held the weight of lessons learned from Marcus's grief and Iris's patient teachings, floating on the gentle breeze like seeds looking for fertile ground. Maya's hand paused above the canvas. For the first time in weeks, she looked away from her repetitive sunset to notice the two young people on the bench, surrounded by broken objects that seemed somehow dignified in their brokenness. Her eyes lingered on Sage's compass, which was moving in slow, contemplative arcs, not seeking magnetic north, but responding to something subtler. The gradual loosening of temporal knots, the gentle return of creative flow. I used to paint storms, Maya said suddenly, her voice rusty from weeks of internal dialogue. Wild, chaotic things that made people feel something real. But someone said they were too emotional, too uncontrolled. So I tried to paint something peaceful, something acceptable. And now... She gestured helplessly at the canvas where the same sun died the same death in the same sky, over and over, like a prayer that had forgotten its own meaning. Maybe, Tempo offered gently, pulling the handless watch from their pocket and holding it where Maya could see its smooth, unmarked face. The storm is still there, just waiting for permission to be wild again. Sometimes the way forward isn't around the loop, but deeper into its center, where we can hear what it's really trying to teach us. Sage contributed his own quiet wisdom, showing Maya how his compass had learned to point not toward fixed direction, but toward whatever brought meaning to the moment. It used to spin frantically looking for north, he explained, his young voice carrying surprising depth, but now it points toward what matters. Maybe paintings can do that too, point toward what's true for you instead of what everyone expects. As if responding to this possibility, Maya's next brushstroke veered slightly from its predetermined path. Just a small deviation, but enough to let a hint of movement into the static sky. The temporal loop around her began to wobble, not breaking entirely, but developing the flexibility that would eventually allow for transformation. Over the following days, Tempo and Sage returned to the bench, not to offer direct intervention, but to provide steady companionship as Maya's creative loop gradually expanded. They brought sandwiches cut into careful triangles and books from Elena's library about artists who had worked in series for years, not out of failure, but devotion to living questions. The identical sunsets began to show weather, clouds that moved, light that shifted, water that carried different stories with each tide. The breakthrough came during a morning when unexpected rain began to fall. Instead of packing up her supplies, Maya let the water blur her careful sunset, watching colors run and blend in ways she couldn't control. For the first time in weeks, she laughed, not with happiness, but with the recognition that chaos could be its own form of beauty, that the storms she had abandoned were still there in her hands, waiting to be welcomed home. "I remember now," she said, her voice carrying wonder as she watched her perfect sunset dissolve into something wild and unpredictable. "I remember why I loved the untamable things." The temporal loop finally transformed, not breaking with violence, but expanding like a flower opening to rain. Each repetition becoming a spiral that carried her deeper into understanding, rather than trapping her in stagnation. As Maya packed her supplies that morning, her movements had the quality of someone preparing for a journey, rather than ending a vigil. The studio settled back into its natural rhythm, time flowing smoothly through spaces that had been knotted with creative despair. And in the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, not threatening, but promising the kind of wild weather that makes the most honest paintings possible. The harbor bells counted the hours with their usual precision, but their voices seemed to carry approval for the small victory that had been won through patience rather than force, through the understanding that sometimes the most profound healing comes from learning to find freedom within repetition, rather than demanding escape from it. The tiny gear in Tempo's pocket pulsed with quiet satisfaction. Another lesson learned in the delicate art of helping time remember its most generous nature. The morning after Maya's creative breakthrough brought a different quality of light to the harbor, as if the very air had learned something about the beauty of embracing imperfection. Tempo woke to find every timepiece in the workshop humming in gentle synchronization, not with mechanical precision, but with the organic rhythm of hearts that had found their natural cadence. The fog rolled in softer now, carrying whispers of change that settled like morning dew on the cobblestones of Harbor Street. It was in this atmosphere of quiet transformation that Tempo noticed Sage standing by the workshop window, his weathered compass resting open in his palm. The needle, which had spent months learning to point toward whatever needed healing most, now trembled with a different kind of certainty, its brass surface catching the pearl-soft light as it pointed steadily, unmistakably toward Tempo. "It's been doing this since dawn," Sage said softly, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a truth they had always known, but never named. Like it's finally found what it was really, searching for all along. His sea-glass eyes met Tempo's with the kind of directness that comes only after friendship, has built a foundation strong enough to support deeper truths. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility, heavy with all the words that had been gathering like morning mist, waiting for the right moment to settle into meaning. Tempo approached slowly, feeling the familiar flutter in their chest that came whenever time itself seemed to pause. Can't pay attention to something precious unfolding. "I used to think I was collecting broken things because I wanted to fix them," Sage continued, his hands gentle around the compass that had become so much more than a navigational tool. "But watching you work, learning to sit with Marcus in his grief, seeing Maya find her way back to storms, I think maybe I was looking for someone who understood that broken doesn't mean worthless. Someone who sees the beauty in things that need tending rather than replacing." The workshop around them seemed to hold its breath, every pendulum pausing at the top of its arc, every spring coiled in perfect tension. Even Iris, bent over a delicate repair at her workbench, stilled her hands as if sensing that this moment required the kind of attention usually reserved for the most precious mechanisms. "You see me," Sage said simply, the words carrying the weight of someone who had spent years feeling invisible, dismissed as the boy who played with garbage by the pier. "Not just the surface of me, but the part that knows how to love broken things back to wholeness, the part that believes everything deserves a second chance to be beautiful." Tempo felt something shift in their chest, like a clock that had been running slightly fast, finally finding its true rhythm. They had always known that Sage was special, had sensed from their first meeting that his gift for seeing beauty in discarded things was as rare and valuable as their own ability to heal temporal wounds. But hearing him speak these truths aloud created something new between them. Not just friendship, but recognition of a deeper partnership. "I see you too," Tempo replied, their voice soft but certain as harbor bells. "The way you handle broken things like they're still precious. The way you never give up on something, just because it's not working the way it's supposed to. You taught me that healing isn't about making things perfect again. It's about helping them find new ways to be whole." As if responding to this mutual recognition, the compass began to glow with gentle warmth, its needle moving in slow, peaceful arcs that encompassed both of them, no longer searching for magnetic north, but having found something more valuable, true north, the kind of direction that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. From her workbench, Iris smiled without looking up, her weathered hands continuing their delicate work, while her heart expanded with the particular joy that comes from watching love bloom in its own perfect time. "Love is another kind of time magic," she said softly, her words floating through the workshop like incense. "It makes ordinary moments feel infinite, and difficult times pass more gently. It teaches us that the most profound healing happens not in isolation, but in the spaces between hearts that have learned to beat in harmony." As autumn painted the harbor in deeper shades of amber and rust, their relationship deepened like roots finding rich soil. They discovered that their combined gifts created something unprecedented. When they worked together, stubborn temporal rickles would soften more readily, as if the distortions themselves responded to the harmony between them. Their love story unfolded in the quiet moments between customers, in shared lunches eaten while surrounded by the gentle symphony of mending timepieces, in evening walks along the pier where they had first met. The compass never pointed toward magnetic north again, but it no longer needed to. It had found something more valuable than direction. It had found home in the space between two hearts that had learned to measure time not in seconds and minutes, but in the depth of shared understanding, in the quality of attention given to whatever needed healing. As winter's first frost began to silver the harbor grass, the workshop settled into its nighttime rhythm with a new quality of contentment. Two young people who had found in each other not just romance but true partnership continued their quiet work of helping time remember its most generous nature, their love adding another voice to the eternal conversation between human hearts and the patient rhythms that connect all things. The harbor bells counted the hours with gentle precision, but their voices seemed to carry a blessing for the love that had bloomed in its own perfect season, unhurried by expectation and untainted by the fear that beautiful things must be fragile. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbor Street, time moved at the speed of deep affection, and every tick carried the promise that the best gifts always arrive exactly when they're meant to be received. The love that had settled between Tempo and Sage like morning dew on harbor stones seemed to tune the entire town to a gentler frequency, creating ripples of harmony that extended far beyond the workshop's walls. Their combined presence had become a quiet blessing, helping neighbors find patience in traffic delays and grace in unexpected changes. It was this very harmony that made the approaching disturbance all the more jarring when it arrived on the wings of late winter winds. The first sign came not from the sky, but from Iris's barometer, which began to hesitate between readings, as if caught between two contradictory thoughts. Tempo noticed it while preparing morning tea, the brass needle wavering with unusual indecision, tapping lightly against the glass as if trying to communicate something urgent. Outside, gulls flew lower than usual, their wings beating a fraction too slowly in the pearl-soft light, and even the harbor bells struck the hour with a faint double echo, as though sound itself had split around some invisible seam in the day. By noon the fog had pooled into the streets in strange drifts, and time itself began developing rickles large enough to see. At the bakery, customers moved through the line too quickly, paying and leaving before they realized they hadn't actually ordered anything. Across the square, a street musician found his melody lagging 2 beats behind his hands, creating an eerie discord that made passers-by pause with inexplicable unease. Children's laughter skipped ahead of their games, then circled back to repeat itself, bright and strange, making parents blink as if they'd dreamed the sound. The storm had not yet broken, but its pressure had already arrived, not merely weather but a tempest of moments themselves, pushing against the town's carefully maintained rhythm until it rippled and buckled like water in a pan before boiling. Tempo felt the approaching chaos like a deep ache in their bones, the handless watch in their pocket growing warm with urgency. No longer pulsing with gentle contentment, but vibrating with the frantic energy of temporal distress. "It's carrying pieces of different times all tangled together," Sage observed, his compass spinning in confused circles for the first time since it had learned to point toward meaning rather than magnetic north. "Like the storm itself has been wounded, and it's spreading that wound wherever it goes." Eleanor arrived at the workshop as if summoned by the growing disturbance, her silver hair catching the strange prismatic light that preceded the storm. Maya followed soon after, her artist's eye tracking the peculiar quality of the air, not the usual grey of approaching weather, but something that seemed to refract time into visible spectra. Even Marcus appeared, carrying extra raincoats and the quiet authority of someone who had learned to weather profound storms. "This kind requires everyone," Iris said softly, her weathered hands steady despite their trembling, eyes bright with the memory of similar disturbances she had witnessed in distant places. "You know what to do. You won't be doing it alone." They moved with gentle purpose, no commands needed, only the woven understanding that had grown between them through shared experiences of healing. Tempo and Sage took the waterfront first, where the sea's breath was stuttering in unnatural intervals. 1, 2, 3. Pause, 1, 2, stretch. An anxious pattern that made fishermen stand with hands on ropes, blinking in confusion as their nets lifted and hovered a second too long before settling. Marcus began to hum an old working tune that had kept time for generations, and other voices joined, low and sure. The song knit the scattered seconds into even cloth, and the water, listening like any creature that has known the honest measure of human rhythm, began to breathe more evenly. Maya chalked gentle lines across the waterfront stones, painting quick dashes like heartbeat marks that guided footsteps to a shared cadence when the temporal currents tried to pull them into chaos. In the town square, where speed had gathered like static electricity, Eleanor stood on the library steps and rang a small bell from the poetry section. "Story time," she called, not to children but to everyone, opening the doors wide as people drifted inside, drawn by something more compelling than whatever task they thought they must finish immediately. "Just 2 slow pages," she told them, placing books into eager hands. In the quiet that followed, you could feel the collective exhale, the momentary surrender of urgency that allowed lost minutes to seep back into those who needed them most. The storm's heart arrived with unprecedented force, visible distortions rippling through the air, where different moments overlapped and interfered with each other. Lightning struck in impossible colors, and thunder rolled with the sound of breaking clocks, as if time itself was being shattered and reformed with each crash. But the community held its formation, each person becoming a point of stability, their collective breathing creating a rhythm strong enough to offer the displaced temporal fragments a path toward resolution rather than destruction. Tempo moved softly through it all, not as a conductor commanding an orchestra, but as someone offering their steady presence to whatever needed healing. They would sit in a sped-up cafe, drinking tea with deliberate slowness, until conversations softened and hurried movements eased. They would walk through sluggish areas where thoughts moved like honey, their purposeful breathing a quiet invitation for time to remember its natural flow. As the storm's peak passed and the temporal distortions began to settle, a profound peace filled the spaces between heartbeats. Every clock had found its proper rhythm, every person had rediscovered their natural pace, and the very air hummed with the satisfaction of chaos transformed through patient, collective care. The harbor bells resumed their faithful counting, but their voices carried a deeper resonance now, as if they had been tuned by the storm's passage to a frequency that spoke not just of measured time, but of community resilience. The town had weathered more than weather. It had learned that the most profound healing happens not through individual heroics, but through ordinary people choosing to breathe together. When the world feels too chaotic to navigate alone, outside, the first stars appeared through clearing clouds, their light steady and reassuring. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbour Street, where wisdom flowed like gentle water between generations, the future settled into place with the quiet certainty of something that had always been meant to be. The morning after the great storm brought a different quality of silence to the harbour town, as if the very air had learned to hold space for healing. In this gentle aftermath, Tempo began to notice something that tugged at their heart like a persistent, quiet bell. Small disturbances in time's flow that gathered around children like morning mist clings to harbour stones. These weren't the grand temporal wounds they had learned to heal in adults, but something more delicate, more tender, like knots in silk thread that required the gentlest touch to untangle. The first sign came when little Aaron from the bakery dropped a tray of morning rolls and then stood frozen, his small hands hovering in the air as if the sound of clattering metal had trapped him in that single startling moment. His eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had seen time itself become unreliable, and around his small form, seconds seemed to pool and eddy like water around a stone in a stream. "Children are like new timepieces," Iris explained that evening, her weathered hands trembling slightly more as she wound the workshop clocks. Their inner rhythms are still forming, still learning to trust the world's steady beat. When something frightens them deeply enough, time can snag inside their hearts, creating little knots that keep them from flowing forward with ease. Other children began appearing in the days that followed, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized as safe. There was Lily, whose words arrived minutes after her lips had shaped them, as if she was speaking through thick honey. Marcus Jr., the fisherman's grandson, whose thoughts raced so far ahead that he lived in tomorrow's worries instead of today's gentle moments. And quiet Emma, who kept drawing the same rain cloud over and over, unable to move past the storm that had shown her that the world could become unpredictable and strange. With Sage's intuitive understanding of broken things and Elena's knowledge of stories that heal, they began transforming the workshop's backroom into something unprecedented, a sanctuary where time moved not at the speed of clocks, but at the pace of mending hearts. Sage arranged cushions in gentle circles and hung a mobile of sea glass that caught afternoon light in patient dancing patterns. Maya painted the ceiling the soft grey-blue of dawn fog, adding tiny stars that only became visible when the room grew quiet and peaceful. The healing happened through play, as all the most profound childhood learning does. They discovered that when Arun held an old music box and breathed with its gentle melody, the trapped moment around him would soften and begin to flow again, his shoulders finally dropping from his ears as the clattering sound found its way back into the past where it belonged. Lily learned to speak to a grandfather clock, whose hands moved slowly enough to match her careful words, proving that the most important conversations happen at the speed of deep consideration, rather than hurried response. "Time isn't something that might hurt you," Tempo would say softly during their afternoon sessions, surrounded by children who were learning to trust the world's rhythms again. "It's like the ocean, vast and powerful, yes, but also capable of the gentlest waves that barely disturb the sand. When time feels scary, we can remember that it knows how to be peaceful too." Marcus brought a cedar bench he had carved from driftwood, understanding without words that healing required furniture built from things that had weathered their own storms and found peace. Eleanor contributed books with pictures that whispered of courage, stories that unfolded at the pace of seasons rather than headlines. Even Maya would slip in during the golden hour, painting invisible pictures with the children on slates that would evaporate at the pace of their breathing, showing them that not everything needed to last forever to be beautiful. The room itself seemed to develop a memory of comfort, its very air growing thick with accumulated patience and understanding. Parents who waited in the main workshop during these sessions found their own hurried thoughts slowing, their conversations deepening into territories they had forgotten existed. The quality of time in the building had become so gentle, so forgiving, that old tensions began to dissolve like sugar in warm tea. As spring painted the harbour in soft greens and the children's temporal knots gradually loosened, word travelled quietly through the community. No signs were posted, no schedules announced, yet people knew. Teachers noticed how certain students, who had been living 3 seconds ahead or 8 seconds behind, began to meet lessons in the soft middle where understanding lives. The harbour bells seemed to ring with deeper satisfaction, as if they too understood that the most important work happened not in grand gestures, but in the patient tending of whatever needed healing. One evening, as lamps were dimmed and the painted stars slowly appeared on the ceiling. Little Emma looked up from a drawing that, for the first time in weeks, showed sunshine breaking through her familiar rain cloud. "Your heart sounds like a clock that learned how to hug," she announced, with the profound seriousness that only children possess. The words settled into the quiet space around them like a blessing, and Tempo understood that they had learned something essential about time's most generous nature, that it always provided exactly what was needed for healing to unfold in its own perfect season. The workshop settled into its nighttime rhythm with a deeper contentment now, knowing that tomorrow would bring more small hearts learning to trust time's gentle flow, more opportunities to prove that patience and presence could heal even the most delicate wounds. The gentle success of the children's healing room had woven itself so naturally into the workshop's rhythm that when Iris began to move differently through the familiar spaces, her steps carrying the particular carefulness of someone learning to navigate a changing relationship with time itself, it felt less like an ending approaching and more like another season preparing to unfold. Her hands, which had trembled only slightly during the great storm, now required longer pauses between delicate adjustments, and she would sometimes sit in the healing room long after the children had gone, watching the painted stars on Maya's ceiling emerge in the gathering dusk. "I'm listening to the layers now," she explained one evening, her voice soft as the whisper of turning pages. "Time isn't the straight line I thought I understood for so many years. It's more like cloth being woven, threads of when I was young lying against threads of when I am now, all of it held together by something I'm only beginning to see." She opened her palm, revealing the tiny gear she had once given Tempo, now returned to rest in her weathered fingers. Even the smallest pieces remember the pattern they belong to. As autumn painted the harbor in deeper shades of amber and rust, Iris began to experience moments that existed in multiple times at once. She would reach for a familiar tool and find herself simultaneously in conversations with her long-dead teacher, the memories so vivid they seemed to be happening alongside the present moment, past and now layered together like transparent sheets of music, creating harmonies she had never noticed when living each moment separately. "This is time's deepest gift," she told Tempo during one of their evening sessions, the handless watch warm and steady in her palm. "Not the measured march of seconds we think we know, but the vast ocean where all moments exist together, swirling and connecting. What we call death isn't time-stopping. It's learning to swim in deeper waters, where everything we've ever loved continues in different currents." The workshop seemed to sense the approaching transformation, its very air growing thick with accumulated patience and understanding. Elena arrived each morning with tea that steamed like small prayers, settling into quiet conversation that required no urgency. Maya painted a tiny star directly above Iris's favorite chair, almost invisible until the light grew soft enough to reveal it. Marcus brought soup in containers that stayed warm longer than physics should allow, and sat reading harbor weather reports in a voice that made even storm warnings sound like lullabies. Sage's compass, ever sensitive to what needed attention most, began pointing not toward magnetic north or temporal disturbances, but toward Iris herself, its needle steady with the kind of certainty that comes only when direction has been found. The children, when they visited, moved with the intuitive reverence that young hearts bring to sacred moments, their own healed rhythms creating a gentle chorus around the woman who had helped create their sanctuary. During these final weeks, Iris shared wisdom that felt less like teaching and more like the natural overflow of a life spent in deep service. "We are gardeners," she said one evening, as the workshop settled into its familiar symphony of gentle ticking. "Not of minutes or mechanisms, but of mercy itself. When the world tangles its time in knots of hurry and fear, we offer the gift of unhurried presence. When hearts get stuck in difficult moments, we sit with them until they remember how to flow again." The end came on a morning when fog rolled in soft and pearl white, carrying whispers of distant places and impossible journeys. Iris had asked them to open the workshop door so she could hear the harbor bells strike the hour. And as their clear voice rang across the water, every timepiece in the shop responded not with individual chimes, but with a synchronized breath. One collective sigh that felt like recognition, like gratitude, like blessing. "I thought it would feel like leaving," Iris whispered, her eyes on the soft edge where morning gathered itself from the mist. "It feels like arriving." She placed her hand over Tempo's where it rested on the arm of her chair, 2 pulses finding a single rhythm. The love we've shared, the healing we've offered, the patience we've learned, these things don't end when our bodies grow tired. They continue in different forms, through different hands, in hearts that have learned to listen. Her final breath was quiet, an intake of tide that released itself like morning fog lifting from harbor water. The handless watch grew still in her palm, not empty but serene, its warmth settling into the wood of the chair as if it had poured itself into the room itself. Around them, the workshop didn't grow colder but more spacious, as though a window had been opened in a house no one realized needed more sky. They stayed with her through the morning, not because there was anything to do, but because staying was the right kind of doing. The community drifted in and out like gentle weather, bringing quiet things. A sprig of rosemary, folded notes, the memory of timepieces that had made lonely kitchens feel companioned. No one hurried. Time itself had chosen to move at the speed of gratitude, and the town obeyed without needing to be told. That evening, as Tempo wound the clocks with Sage beside them, the act felt like prayer delivered in small, precise motions. They didn't try to hold the moment still, but did what Iris had taught them, befriended it. In the soft space between tick and tock, they could almost hear her quiet laughter, the way she used to chuckle when a stubborn spring finally settled into its proper place, when wisdom finally landed where it was meant to be received. The harbor bells counted the hours with their usual precision, but their voices carried a blessing for the teacher who had transformed rather than departed, and for the student who would carry the work forward with hands that had learned to tend time's most generous, nature. The morning after Iris's gentle departure brought a silence that felt not empty but expectant, like the pause between musical movements when the audience holds its breath before the next theme begins. Tempo moved through the workshop, with hands that remembered every lesson, every patient correction, every moment when Iris had demonstrated that the most profound repairs happen through presence rather than technique. The handless watch rested now in the small drawer where Iris had kept her most precious tools, its smooth surface holding the memory of her touch like amber holds ancient light. As spring painted the harbor in soft greens and the community settled into the rhythm of life without their beloved clockmaker, something beautiful began to emerge from the spaces Iris had left behind. People arrived not just with broken timepieces, but with broken moments, relationships that had gotten stuck in old patterns, grief that wouldn't flow, joy that felt too fragile to trust. They came carrying temporal wounds that couldn't be seen, but could be felt in the way conversations stumbled or silences stretched too long. Sage placed a narrow bench just inside the door, beneath the window that caught late afternoon light. He sanded it smooth and rubbed it with oil that smelled faintly of citrus, then set a small card on its edge in his careful handwriting. "Sit here as long as you need. Healing doesn't start until you're ready." The first time a neighbor sat and cried without apology, the clocks hummed as if in agreement, and the bench took on a gravity all its own, the kind of gravity that didn't pull down but held close. Mrs. Chen was among the first to understand this transformation, arriving with her late husband's pocket watch, but staying to speak of how time had felt frozen since his passing. "I know he's gone," she said softly, settling into the chair where Iris had once listened with such patient attention. "But I can't seem to move forward. Every morning feels like the same morning, and I don't know how to want tomorrow again." Tempo listened with the deep attention they had learned from watching Iris receive people's stories, understanding that healing often began not with solutions, but with the simple gift of being truly heard. They could feel the temporal knot around Mrs. Chen's heart, not the sharp wound of fresh grief, but the gentler stagnation of someone who had forgotten how to be curious about what might come. "Next sometimes," Tempo said softly, their young voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "The way forward isn't about forcing time to move faster, but about finding small things to be interested in again, little mysteries that make us want to see what happens tomorrow." Maya painted a sign that hung above the counter, not announcing services or prices, but showing a small harbor at dusk, 2 boats tethered to a shared post. The water so still, you could hear the quiet in it. Eleanor brought a basket she called Borrowed Minutes and filled it with thin paper slips, each one inviting a small permission. "Take 5 to breathe. Step outside and feel the sun on your face. Read a paragraph slowly. People chuckled at first, then began to return with stories of how a borrowed minute had returned to them as an hour of ease they hadn't known. How to ask for the workshop became a sanctuary where the hurried pace of the outside world was gently filtered. A young couple arrived holding hands in that tentative way that admits pressure without saying where it hurts. Their relationship caught in a repetitive argument that replayed itself endlessly. When Tempo lifted their kitchen timer, feeling the memory of dinners eaten on the run and laughter interrupted, they guided the couple to the bench. "It might take a few minutes," they said, which in this place meant you have all the time you need. Sage's compass, ever sensitive to what needed attention most, had become more than a directional instrument. It served as a tool for sensing what quality of care each person's heart required. When someone arrived carrying temporal distress, the needle would respond with gentle movements, pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward the specific healing that moment demanded. Together, they discovered that their combined gifts created something unprecedented in the community. When they worked in harmony, stubborn temporal knots would soften more readily, as if the distortions themselves responded to the love that flowed between them. Their relationship had become part of the healing itself, a demonstration that time's most generous nature flourished. In the spaces between hearts that had learned to beat in synchrony, as months passed and their practice deepened, Tempo began to understand that they had inherited more than Iris's workshop. They had received her role as a keeper of time's gentler possibilities. The handless watch in its drawer pulsed with quiet approval when particularly difficult temporal knots were untangled. When someone rediscovered their natural rhythm after months or years of feeling displaced from their own life. One evening, as lamps were lit and the workshop settled into its familiar symphony of gentle ticking, a young person arrived at the door with eyes that held the particular brightness of someone who had seen time itself become unreliable. They carried themselves with the careful movements of someone learning to navigate a gift they didn't yet understand. And when they spoke, their words came with the hesitant precision of someone who had discovered that their presence could affect the flow of moments around them. "I think I might be like you," they said softly, their voice barely louder than the gentle ticking that filled the workshop. "Sometimes clocks speed up when I'm nervous and slow down when I'm happy, and I don't know how to make it stop, or even if I should want to." Tempo looked into those familiar, uncertain eyes and felt something settle into place with the quiet certainty of a key finding its proper lock. The cycle was beginning again. Teacher preparing to become student, student preparing to become teacher. The ancient dance of wisdom passed like a carefully tended flame from one heart to another. The harbor bells counted the hours with gentle precision, their voices carrying the promise that time's most generous nature would continue to be tended by hands that had learned to work not against its flow, but in harmony with its deepest rhythms. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbor Street, where broken moments came to be understood rather than simply repaired, the future settled into place with the quiet certainty of something that had always been meant to be. The young person who appeared in the doorway that fog-wrapped evening carried themselves with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be careful with a gift that felt larger than understanding. Their silhouette wavered slightly, as if the air around them could not quite hold still, and when they spoke, their voice held the gentle tremor of someone testing whether truth was safe to share in this new place. "My name is River," they said softly, the words floating through the workshop like morning mist finding its way between harbor stones. "I've traveled from the inland valleys where time moves differently, slower in some places, faster in others, creating pockets of confusion that make ordinary life feel like walking through a house where all the clocks have been set to different hours." Tempo felt the familiar flutter in their chest, the recognition that arrives when one time tender encounters another. The handless watch in its drawer seemed to pulse with quiet approval, and around them, every timepiece in the workshop settled into a more harmonious cadence, as if welcoming a new voice to their gentle symphony. River settled into the chair that had once held Iris's patient presence, their hands folded with the precision of someone who had learned to monitor their own emotional weather. "It started when I was 7, they explained, their voice carrying the weight of years spent feeling different, displaced. "My grandmother's mantel clock would slow down whenever I cried and speed up when I laughed. She thought it was charming at first, but then other timepieces started responding, and people began to notice that conversations felt different when I was around, either rushed or stretched, never quite natural. Tempo recognized the fear beneath River's careful words, the particular anxiety that comes from possessing abilities that make others uncomfortable. They remembered their own early confusion, the way Iris had first helped them understand that their gift was not a burden to be hidden, but a calling to be embraced, with wisdom and care. The world needs people who understand that time isn't just measurement, Tempo said gently, their voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned these truths through years of patient practice. It's relationship, connection, the space where healing happens when we stop rushing toward what we think we want and start paying attention to what's actually needed. Sage approached with the quiet grace that had become his signature, carrying a cup of tea that steamed like small prayers in the lamplit air. His compass, ever sensitive to what needed attention most, rested peacefully in his pocket, its needle pointing steadily toward River with the kind of certainty that comes from recognizing a kindred spirit. "Oh, you're not broken," Sage told River, settling onto the bench he had crafted from driftwood that had weathered its own storms and found peace. "You're just tuned to a different frequency than most people, like a radio that can pick up stations others can't hear. The question isn't how to turn it off, but how to use it in service of something beautiful." As the days passed and River settled into the rhythm of the workshop, Tempo discovered the profound satisfaction that comes from passing on hard-won wisdom to someone ready to receive it. They shared Iris's teachings about befriending time rather than controlling it, demonstrated the gentle breathing techniques that helped smooth temporal rickles, and explained how to sense the difference between mechanical malfunction and emotional disturbance in the timepieces that arrived for healing. Time isn't linear, Tempo explained during one of their evening sessions, the workshop filled with the soft layered symphony of gentle ticking. It's more like water, finding its own level, flowing around obstacles, sometimes rushing, sometimes resting, but always seeking harmony with whatever contains it. We don't control the river, but we can help it remember its most generous nature. The teaching happened through shared work rather than formal lessons. When Mrs. Patterson arrived with her kitchen timer that had been racing anxiously since her daughter moved away for college, River learned to feel the temporal knot of separation anxiety and help it untangle through patient presence. When young Tommy brought his grandfather's watch that had stopped at the moment of bad news, River discovered how to sit with frozen grief until it was ready to flow again. Elena visited regularly, bringing books about time from cultures around the world, stories that spoke of temporal gifts as blessings rather than curses. Maya painted a small symbol on the workshop's back wall, a river flowing through different landscapes, sometimes rushing over stones, sometimes pooling in quiet eddies, always moving toward the sea, but taking its time to nourish everything along its banks. The children from the healing room, with their intuitive wisdom, also played an unwitting part in River's education. They saw them not as strange, but as another kind of friend, someone who understood the secret language of moments. Little Emma, who had once drawn endless rain clouds, offered River a drawing of two suns in one sky, explaining with the profound seriousness that only children possess. Sometimes morning doesn't want to let go of evening, and that's okay too. As autumn painted the harbor in deeper shades of amber and rust, River's confidence grew like roots finding rich soil. They learned to recognize the subtle signs of temporal distress, the way hurried people carried tension in their shoulders that affected nearby clocks, how places could accumulate temporal static from years of anxiety or impatience. The particular quality of silence that meant time itself was holding its breath, waiting for permission to flow again. The breakthrough came during a morning when the fog rolled in thick and pearl white, carrying whispers of change that settled like morning dew on the cobblestones. River was working with a grandfather clock that had arrived from a house where arguments had been echoing for months, its pendulum swinging in agitated arcs that spoke of absorbed discord. Instead of trying to adjust the mechanism, River simply sat with it, breathing in the rhythm they had learned from Tempo, allowing their own steady heartbeat to remind the clock of time's more peaceful possibilities. Under River's patient presence, the grandfather clock's frantic swinging gradually eased into something more sustainable, its tick becoming less a cry for escape and more a sigh of relief. "It's not about making it stop," River whispered, looking at Tempo with shining eyes that held both relief and a quiet sense of purpose. "It's about helping it find its song again." Tempo smiled, feeling the warmth that comes from witnessing understanding bloom in another's heart. The cycle was continuing. Wisdom passed like a carefully tended flame. Understanding deepened through the act of sharing. The eternal conversation between human hearts and time's most generous nature, flowing forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. The harbour bells counted the hours with gentle precision, their voices carrying approval for the ancient tradition continuing, for hands learning to 10 times gentler possibilities, for the quiet certainty that healing would continue to happen at exactly the right pace, in exactly the right season, through hearts that had learned to beat in harmony with time's deepest rhythms. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbour Street, where broken moments came to be understood rather than simply repaired, the future settled into place with the gentle certainty of something that had always been meant to be. The seasons turned with the patience of pages in a well-loved book, each one adding its own gentle weight to the story that had grown around the workshop on Harbour Street. Years did not hurry past but settled like morning mist, finding its natural level. And in this unhurried passage of time, Tempo began to understand what Iris had meant about living in the spaces between moments, not rushing toward what came next, but dwelling fully in the eternal now that held all possibilities. The harbour town had learned a different way of breathing. Where once people had moved with the sharp urgency of those who believed time was chasing them, now conversations lingered at street corners like old friends reluctant to part. The bakery posted a small sign that read, "Back in 3 deep breaths," and customers would wait without complaint, some even using the pause to notice how afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing above the bread display. The library's evening readings had evolved into what Elena called the long pause, 10 minutes when anyone within hearing of the poetry bell could gather for 2 pages read aloud, creating pockets of shared stillness that rippled outward like stones dropped in calm water. Tempo's hair had silvered at the temples, and their hands moved with the deliberate grace of someone whose craft had deepened beyond technique into something approaching art. Sage aged beside them with the weathered beauty of driftwood, smoothed by years of patient tides, his compass now worn smooth by decades of faithful service. Their love had evolved past the need for declaration, existing instead in the way they moved through shared tasks, the cup of tea appearing exactly when needed, the hand that steadied a difficult repair without being asked, the comfortable silence that said, more than any conversation about the profound, contentment of 2 hearts that had learned to beat in perfect synchrony. The workshop had transformed into something unprecedented in the town's memory, a sanctuary, where people brought not just broken timepieces but broken relationships with time itself. A young teacher arrived carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been running on borrowed minutes for months, her days fragmented by the impossible mathematics of caring for everyone else before herself. Under Tempo's patient guidance, she learned to recognize the difference between genuine urgency and the anxiety that made every moment feel like an emergency. And the elderly widower came with hands that shook not from age, but from a lifetime of racing against deadlines that had taught him to fear the very passage of moments. River, now grown into their gift with quiet confidence, sat with him through several afternoon sessions, teaching him to breathe with rather than against time's natural rhythm, until his hands found their own steady pace again. The children who had once drawn endless rain clouds were grown now, returning before job interviews and after heartbreaks, before weddings and after moving days, to sit beneath Maya's painted ceiling, where the stars still emerged in gathering darkness. They raised their own children with a different understanding of time, less hurried, more curious, teaching their young ones to notice how their breathing could tune them to whatever rhythm the moment required. River had flourished in ways that filled Tempo's heart with the particular satisfaction that comes from watching, understanding bloom in another's soul. They traveled now to the inland valleys where time moved in strange currents, carrying with them the wisdom they had learned in the workshop and the confidence to trust their own intuitive understanding of temporal healing. When they returned for visits, their stories sounded like lullabies, a clock that calmed after a difficult family reconciliation, a doorway where arguments had been snagging for years, until a patient conversation at sunset smoothed the temporal knot. One autumn evening, as the harbour bells counted the hours with their familiar precision, River announced their intention to establish their own practice in the mountain town where they had been born. "The work is calling me there," they said softly, their voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally learned to trust their own inner compass. "There are people who need what we've learned here, and I think I'm ready to carry it forward." Tempo felt no sadness at this news, only the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing a well-tended seed take root in its proper soil. The cycle was completing itself, student becoming teacher, wisdom flowing forward like a river finding its way to the sea. They placed the handless watch in River's palm, its smooth surface warm with accumulated understanding. "This isn't about controlling time," Tempo said, echoing words Iris had spoken decades before. "It's about helping people remember that they are part of time's great rhythm, not separate from it. When we heal our relationship with time, we heal our relationship with life itself." As River departed with the blessing of the entire community, Tempo and Sage settled into the rhythm of their later years, with the grace of two people who had learned that the most profound wealth was measured not in minutes saved, but in moments fully lived. The workshop continued its gentle work, now aided by others who had discovered their own gifts for temporal healing. Maya, whose paintings helped people see that difficult emotions could be weathered like storms. Elena, whose carefully chosen stories arrived at exactly the right moment to shift someone's perspective. The town had become a living demonstration of what was possible when an entire community learned to move at the speed of deep consideration rather than surface urgency. People walked differently, paused at intersections, not just to check for traffic but to notice the way morning light caught in storefront windows, lingered over conversations instead of rushing toward the next obligation. On foggy evenings when they walked the pier where they had first met, Sage's compass rested warm in his pocket, no longer needing to point toward anything because it had found true north, not a direction on any map, but the magnetic pull of love that had learned to move at the speed of deep understanding. The harbour bells counted the hours with gentle approval, their voices carrying the blessing of a community that had discovered time's most generous nature. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbour Street, where broken moments came to be understood rather than simply repaired, the future continued to settle into place with the quiet certainty of something that had always been meant to be, preparing for whatever final wisdom the years might yet reveal. The final wisdom arrived the way morning fog lifts from harbour water, gradually, gently, revealing landscapes that had always been there but were now seen with perfect clarity. As the seasons turned with the patience of pages in a well-loved book, Tempo began to experience what Iris had once described as time's deeper layers. Moments no longer arrived as separate beads on a string, but as transparent silk, each one containing echoes of all the others, past and future existing together in the vast, shimmering now. Their hair had silvered at the temples, and their hands moved with the deliberate grace of someone whose craft had deepened beyond technique into something approaching art. The workshop breathed around them with familiar contentment, every timepiece contributing its voice to the gentle symphony that had become the soundtrack of their shared life. Sage aged beside them with the weathered beauty of driftwood, smoothed by years of patient tides, his compass now worn soft by decades of faithful service, resting peacefully on the workbench as if it had finally found its ultimate home. The harbour town had learned a different way of breathing over the years. Where once people had moved with the sharp urgency of those who believed time was chasing them, now conversations lingered at street corners like old friends reluctant to part. The bakery still posted its gentle sign, "Back in 3 deep breaths," and customers would wait without complaint, some using the pause to notice how afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing above the bread display. Eleanor's poetry bell continued to call people to the long pause, creating pockets of shared stillness that rippled outward like stones dropped in calm water. Letters arrived regularly from River in the mountain town, written in a hand that had learned patience. "The watch you trusted me with hums on the days when fear visits," River wrote, "and rests on the days when someone remembers how to breathe." A little girl sat with a clock that had stopped at her grandmother's last bedtime. "We didn't fix the hands. We listened and the room put itself back together." On the back of one letter, River had sketched a stream meandering through pines, with tiny specks for stars scattered across the water, as if the night sky had knelt to drink. In the early afternoons, when light pooled on the floorboards like honey, Tempo and Sage would sit together by the window with a plate of sandwiches cut into careful triangles, a ritual that had never grown old. The compass lived quietly in Sage's pocket, still warm from use, no longer pointing toward any particular direction but radiating the contentment of something that had found its true north in the magnetic pull of love that had learned to exist beyond the boundaries of measured moments. As autumn painted the harbor in its deepest shades, Tempo began to experience moments when they could reach for a familiar tool and simultaneously feel Iris's hands guiding their first uncertain repairs. River's eager questions, the countless people who had sat in the workshop chair learning to trust time's gentler nature. These weren't memories but living experiences, all existing together in a harmony that made their heart expand with inexplicable joy. "You're becoming like Iris did," Sage said softly one evening, his weathered hand warm on Tempo's shoulder. "Time is showing you its deeper layers." The experience was not frightening but profoundly peaceful, like sinking into warm water that held the memory of every gentle rain, every tear of joy that had ever been shed. The handless watch, returned to its place in the small drawer after River's visit, pulsed with accumulated wisdom, not just Iris's teachings or Tempo's discoveries, but the collective understanding of all who had ever learned to befriend time rather than battle it. Its smooth surface held the memory of every temporal knot that had been gently untangled, every frozen moment that had been coaxed back into flow, every heart that had learned to beat in harmony with time's deepest rhythms. Children, now grown and bringing their own young ones, would often point to the workshop and tell stories of the gentle people who helped time remember its true nature. They spoke of the healing room where time moved at the pace of a child's heart, of the library where lost minutes could be rediscovered, of the artist who learned to paint storms again, and of the fisherman who found his way back from a frozen dawn. These weren't grand tales of heroics, but quiet legends of small acts of kindness, of patient listening, and of the profound magic that lies in simply being present. As winter's first frost began to silver the harbor grass, Tempo understood with perfect clarity that their life's work had never been about fixing broken time, for time was never truly broken. It had been about helping people recognize that time was only misunderstood, tangled by anxiety, or wounded by hurry. The rickles they had smoothed were never disruptions but invitations, calls to pay attention, to be present, to love more deeply in whatever precious time we're given. The morning when Tempo's breathing finally synchronized completely with the eternal tide that moves beneath all measured moments, Sage was there, his hand steady and warm, his compass pointing toward the love that had become their true north. The workshop didn't grow cold but more spacious, as if a window had been opened to let in more sky, more possibility, more of the vast ocean where all moments exist together in perfect harmony. The community gathered not in mourning, but in quiet celebration, understanding without words that they had witnessed not an ending but a transformation. The harbor bells rang not a funeral toll but a blessing, their voices carrying, across the water, the news that another time tender had learned to swim in the deeper currents where love continues in forms too beautiful for ordinary measurement. As the last rays of sunset painted the room in hues of amber and rose, Tempo smiled with the profound peace of someone who had learned that the greatest gift was not to control time, but to surrender to its gentle, unwavering flow. There was no fear, only a quiet exhale, a soft letting go into the vast, shimmering ocean where all the love they had given would continue to flow, touching hearts and healing moments in ways that would ripple forward through generations yet to come. In the clockmaker's shop on Harbor Street, where broken moments had come to be understood rather than simply repaired, the future settled into place with the quiet certainty of something that had always been meant to be. New hands would learn to tend the gentle mechanisms. New hearts would discover their calling to help time remember its healing nature, and somewhere in the eternal conversation between human souls and the patient rhythms that connect all things, Tempo's wisdom would continue to echo like the sweetest chime, and with that, they stretched into the stars, becoming part of the vast, gentle rhythm that holds all things in perfect time, all hearts in perfect harmony, all moments in the eternal embrace of love that has learned to exist everywhere at once. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.